Welcome to Restoring the Mind. My name is Khalid Mahmood. My guest this week is Alex Krainer. He is an expert in hedge funds. His Twitter account is Naked Hedgie, thus Hedgie. He has written three books: Mastering Uncertainty in Commodities Trading in 2015, Grand Deception in 2017, and Alex Krainer's Trend Following Bible in 2021. All these books are available to download from his website. Welcome to Restoring the Mind, Alex.
Thank you very much for the invite, Khalid, and good to be with you.
Right, you are in Monaco.
Yes,
I,
correct.
I am I am in England. Our mutual neighbor is France, where Emmanuel Macron has just won the French presidential elections. Where do you see France heading after the elections? Do you expect any significant changes?
I expect social uprisings because even before Emmanuel Macron's re-election, France has been consistently scoring very, very low on the polls. When they ask people, do you think the country is moving in the right direction? And already, I think in 2016, 2017, as little as 11% of French electorate thought that the country was moving in the right direction. Since then, we've had yellow vests protest in the later stages of the pandemic. Over the last 2 years, we've had weekend after weekend after weekend of protests. And I think that re-election of Emmanuel Macron is only going to exacerbate the social pressures that are pushing people to revolt. So I think that we're going to see further social uprisings, and the consequences are anyone's guess. Macron has taken the side of NATO in the conflict against Russia. I do not feel that the majority of the French people are with him, particularly when it comes to the draconian sanctions that have been imposed on Russia and that are going to have very severe repercussions on French economy, particularly let's say next fall and winter, when shortages of fuel and gas are likely to hit the French market. France is a little bit better insulated in the sense that it has invested heavily in the nuclear power. So at least with regards to electricity, it is well provisioned. But with regards to natural gas and crude oil and diesel, it might start to fall short. It's going to push up prices. It's going to push up prices of food. So the consequences, I think, would be very difficult to envision at this point. I'll add another thing. I've observed also that Emmanuel Macron has a very fragile support in the country's military and police forces. So there has been open threats of a military coup in the recent past, and we, we can't really know what's going on in the bowels of the French establishment, but the future promises to be extremely interesting.
Okay. I mean, France and Germany are probably one of the biggest economies of Europe, and Russia is the biggest, has been the biggest supplier for the Europe in general in terms of energy. Where do you see Europe going for its future security? Would it kind of which the Americans want them to kind of wean away from the Russians, or will they kind of go back to the Russians again?
I think that longer term they're going to inevitably they're going to have to make nice with the Russians because when we say that Germany and France are the largest economies in Europe, we have to qualify that a little bit because of the way that the we conventionally size these economies. So like economists calculate gross domestic product, and then they say like, this is the biggest economy, and then the next one is this one and that one and that one. But as if we take things like purchasing power parity into account, then Russia is about on par with Germany, the same size economy and a little bit larger than the French economy. And then another thing that needs to be taken into account is that the Western economies are heavily geared towards services. So in the European Union, I think on average, 70% of the GDP are services. And so, we all need services like, healthcare and transportation and so on. But, like then you have waiters and bartenders, and this is, this is legitimate part of the economy, but it's not the real strength. So if we look at the just manufacturing and resources, which in these let's say fragile times, these tense times with possibility of military confrontations, if we take that into account, then Russia is much, much larger and much more important as an economy than most of European nations, including the UK. And, Russia plus China and Russia's other alliances, it's friendly relationships with Iran, with India, and with other nations in the region, makes this an extraordinarily powerful bloc. And Europe will either sink into dark ages, or it's going to have to turn towards Russia, make nice, and find ways of constructive cooperation, as well as a new security architecture for the continent. Now, the question is whether the democratic will of the people will be able to prevail over the entrenched, ossified state bureaucracies that are still loyal and beholden to the empire, which, today we say it's the US, but, the empire actually is kind of a fluid concept, because the US is today the empire's main political, economic, and military muscle, but the empire actually represents a network of vested interests that are present in the United States, but also in London, Paris, Stockholm, Brussels, and other European centers of power. So, this network of vested interests will definitely try to keep an adversarial relationship against Russia, but that's going to set it at odds with most of the people of Europe and the United States. And so that's where I see that we will see significant social uprisings in the near future. And that's where the future of Europe will be defined. Are the people going to carry the day, or are the, parasitical elite power structures going to carry the day? I think that if you give it enough time, inevitably, I think the people will prevail, but it's hard to say how that's going to play out, how long it might take. If a narrow segment of elite people in power try to preserve their positions, we see that in history that doesn't really work. In the Soviet Union has fallen apart, the whole Soviet bloc has fallen apart. We've seen dictatorships in Spain, in South America, and Southeast Asia also fall apart. They, they can rule with force and with repression, but ultimately that that isn't sustainable. It doesn't have the staying power. Uh, Unfortunately, it's very, very difficult to predict at how fast and in what way these things are going to play out.
Okay. Do you see the West kind of, the West narrative, for example, the America, whatever America says, right, is kind of at the moment using that narrative to kind of control the Europe, but not only Europe, actually, it's also trying to control the other countries, smaller countries like Pakistan. And there was recently a regime change in Pakistan simply because Pakistan decided or was thinking of going to Russia to buy some gas, oil, and wheat, etc. But America said you can't do that. Whereas the Pakistani Prime Minister kind of what adamant to continue on that path. Eventually, the military had to kind of get involved and remove the prime minister, etc. And now the Pakistani government is pro-America again. So this the America's the hegemon's narrative. Okay, how long do you see this narrative prevailing in Europe, and how long do you think that Europe will obey America? And before the Europe kind of tries to say, okay, enough is enough, we're going to follow our own path now.
Well, I think that we've already seen the beginning of the end of this narrative that's been kind of holding the Western Bloc together. And, years back when we discovered that the US National Security Agency, or CIA, were tapping the telephones, the mobile phones of European leaders like Angela Merkel, it was a little bit surprising. Then when we saw in 2013, 2014, we saw the Americans order European nations like Italy, Austria, and I think Italy and Austria basically force the plane of Bolivia's President Evo Morales to land because they suspected that Evo Morales had Edward Snowden on board, and that he was giving him a lift out of Russia. And then the European countries, to obey the order from the United States, acted in clear violation of international law. That was a little bit of a surprise as well. But the relationship of the sovereign and the vassals that exists between the United States and Europe wasn't really so visible. The narrative was more, these are all Western countries united by their values, which is, freedom, democracy, human rights, etc. I think that today it is very, very clear that this narrative is false, that it's only a facade, and that in reality we have a pretty feudal set of relationships where you have one hegemon and everybody else is a vassal. And I think that now that the empire is in dire straits, they lost their foothold in Afghanistan, and they had a series of failed regime changes, change operations like Belarus and Kazakhstan, and they are losing their stranglehold on the Middle East, and things are looking very, very challenging for the empire at this moment. The hegemon has had to, let's say, to antagonize his vassals to act against their best interest, like forcing Germany to cut the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which the Germans themselves requested the Russians to build for them. So in 2015, Angela Merkel went to Moscow and she begged Vladimir Putin to create a new pipeline to satisfy Germany's demand for natural gas. And now the hegemon is obliging Germany to actually commit suicide by cutting itself off from Russian energy sources, which is not in Germany's interest, because it's an estimated 60% of German manufacturing is going to collapse if they lose access to Russian oil and gas.
Why is Germany doing it then?
Well, I think that simply because the ruling establishment has been so co-opted and so infiltrated by the servants of the empire, by the agents of secret diplomacy and security, deep state, that they are taking Germany simply as a hostage, as a battering ram in their proxy war against Russia. And so, the legitimate democratic institutions of government in Germany are subservient to these deep state power networks. And when it comes to fighting the decisive battle for the empire, which is, today pretty much delineated as the empire versus the multipolar world or global order, which, in a way is the empire versus the whole rest of the humanity. The empire no longer cares about the niceties of democratic institutions and the will of the people. It is fighting for its survival. And, we have to define what that is, because ever since the days of the British Empire, the overarching imperative has been to defend the empire's dominance of the Eurasian landmass, meaning, pretty much the whole continent, include, from Europe all the way to Japan, because that's where most of the world's GDP is, because it's where 70% of the global energy reserves are, the most of the other natural resources, the labor power. And so the greatest source of wealth for Western financiers is exactly located on the Eurasian landmass. Now, this is not something that you can possibly control militarily. You cannot field big enough armies to keep all these countries under control and in your subservience. So the way to control it is to keep the continent covered with small client states that you can always pit one against the other and keep them weak, always as your vassals. And that precludes emergence of sovereign power that can say no to the empire. And so ever since the days of Halford Mackinder, who is the first who explicitly formulated this imperative, it's been extremely important for the empire to prevent emergence of Eurasian hegemon other than, the British or American empire. So emergence of Russia as a sovereign power or China as a sovereign power has been the thing that they've been extremely anxious to prevent from happening. So now that we have a strong Russia and a strong China, the empire's fight for survival demands that these powers be somehow broken up, regime changed, or destroyed. So that's where we have this now desperate struggle between Russia and the West through a proxy war in Ukraine, because it is the West's attempt to weaken Russia, to drag it into a quagmire like Afghanistan, to destabilize it and to ultimately regime change it with the same objective, which has been, formulated several times in the past, that ideally Russia should be broken up into five smaller republics that would again then become the, clients of the and vassals of the empire.
Okay, Alex, one of the way the hegemon has kind of prevailed is through briberies and corruption. Okay, in the past, giving money and millions to the elites in their countries, in smaller countries, in the like you said, the vassal states. Okay, but now the currencies are going to be changed. The central bank and digital currency (CBDCs) are going to be issued soon. Can you, first thing is, can you envisage a long-term future for the CBD, or cashless society? And if they are there, how will the hegemon be able to kind of bribe with the CBDC issued currencies to their, for example, in Pakistan, they would probably bribe the elite there. And how would you kind of see that happening with the digital currencies, if especially if the digital currencies are programmable and traceable, so you know where the money's come from, where it's going.
Yes, it's indeed a very unattractive harebrained scheme on the part of the global ruling class. First of all, introducing digital currencies wouldn't be very complicated, and it could be done in the near future. But what they have in mind, because digital currencies don't really solve their problems, what they want to have is programmable digital currencies, as you said. And this entails a whole layer of complications that they did not solve and did not prepare. So going into this pandemic, one of the things that was meant to happen is that, amid the great fear of the virus, they would have normally withdrawn the banknotes and the coins and obliged everybody to only use digital money. Fine, fair enough. In some countries, this is already largely the case, like Sweden, where cash is, only marginally used. Most people just use digital money through their phones and their credit cards and so forth. But this programmable kind of digital currencies is not even on the horizon. So I know I've read statements and interviews by various bankers, including Mark Carney, including Agustin Carstens of the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, who have pretty much kind of indicated that they're very far behind schedule in developing even such a solution and the infrastructure that it would entail. And one of the high-ranking officials of the International Monetary Fund pretty much said that he didn't see programmable kind of digital currencies being implemented even within a decade. So it's not going to come very soon. And obviously, this would create a huge problem for them in terms of bribing their commanding officers in vassal states. But it's not just the money. It's one thing to bribe public officials. It's another thing to defend them. Because you have to not only bribe public officials, you also have to provide them protection. It's like a protection racket, literally. And so this has started to unravel, and we could see it very clearly in the case of Afghanistan, where last August, when the Taliban walked into Kabul unopposed, in spite of all the nation building that the Americans have attempted to do, and training the Afghan army and giving them $85 billion worth of military material and weapons and so forth, the whole thing imploded like a house of cards. And then we saw the spectacle of the Afghani president fleeing the country with all that cash that he was bribed with. Sure. And also the head of the Afghan central bank fleeing the country with the money that he was bribed with. And so, I think that this was a very, very clear signal to many of the empire's vassals in the region and pretty much everywhere in the world that the empire is losing the ability to offer them protection. Sure. And so this for sure, this woke up many of them to understand that new realities are shaping up and that they have to start talking with the new sheriff in town, which is Russia and China, and to an extent Iran in the Middle Eastern region, and that they also have to make nice with their people, because this bribery doesn't help them if the people can storm their palaces and take them out of power. So I think that this has the fall of Afghanistan back into Taliban hands has been a very rude awakening for everybody who's plugged into this imperial security architecture, because it's really unraveling.
Okay. A last question on how do you see the future of cryptocurrencies? Would you kind of say the crypto, in the future, would you advise people to go for cryptos, or would you advise people to go for gold and silver? Which is better in terms of security and reliability?
Yeah, I tend to be more inclined to gold and silver for a number of reasons. Gold and silver are the only kinds of currencies that you can hold even if the electricity goes down, even if the internet networks go down. Gold and silver don't need to be constantly powered with electricity. Gold and silver are the only kinds of assets, monetary assets, that don't have a counterparty risk. So, like when you hold it in your hands, if you didn't steal it, you acquire them lawfully, they're yours, and you're not exposed to any other counterparty risk. Then there's also the difficulty of transacting with these currencies. If governments withdraw cash, if they introduce digital currencies, this could actually completely kill the cryptos, because unless a nation makes cryptos a legal tender, unless you can pay taxes in cryptocurrency, that could be that could be game over for things like Bitcoin, because to pay your taxes and to conduct some of the purchases that you're obliged to use cash for, you're going to have to convert your Bitcoin into whatever it is that is legal tender. And at that node, the government knows that you have this. They know, it's not for nothing that some months ago the United States Internal Revenue Service, their tax collectors, issued an order to the banks that they have to report every transaction of over $600 that their clients engaged in, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so, unless you're able to conduct all of your transactions via cryptos, the authorities are going to have ways of taxing you, of forcing you to convert them into legal tender money, and at that point their usefulness becomes severely constrained. Maybe only as a no longer as a real currency, but only as an asset to speculate on. So I think that I get the technology of the distributed ledger I recognize that it's extraordinarily powerful,
Mm-hmm.
but it is still fragile. It can still be jeopardized by the government and monetary authorities, and until it becomes an accepted way of conducting everyday purchases, like if you fix your car, you pay in Bitcoin. If you go buy your groceries, you can buy in Bitcoin. Until that happens and is widely accepted, I think the whole thing is still fragile as a currency. And now I think we have to recognize that primarily its usefulness is as a speculation asset.
Okay. Thank you very much. Alex, can you tell the listeners how they can actually reach your website and your Twitter account, or how they can contact you if they...
Yeah, sure. So I'm on Twitter as @nakedhedgy. I have a professional website called iSystem Trend Following. So this is for traders and investors. I publish daily trend compass reports, and if anybody out there is managing their own personal portfolios, they can subscribe to the newsletter. 1 month test drive is always free of charge, so they understand what it is that I publish. Under the About tab on my iSystem Trend Following website, they can find my 2 business titles, which are available for download free. They used to be published at Amazon, but Amazon unfortunately delisted me and banned all my books. And I also have a personal blog called The Naked Hedgy, where I publish, let's say, on a broader set of subjects that includes history and psychology and certain spiritual musings and so forth. So that's basically the bulk of my presence in the social media.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Alex.
Thank you for having me, Khalid. It was a pleasure to talk.
Thank you.